Every Friday and Saturday night, for your dancing pleasure, the Steve Kovac Quartet played at Vito's Log Cabin on Route 12. And on those two nights, as Steve himself liked to say, winking over the rim of his rye and ginger, the joint really jumped. Piano, bass, tenor sax, and drums, they prided themselves on versatility. They could play anything in any style you wanted to name. And to judge from the delight that swam in their eyes, they had no idea of what inferior musicians they were. In the three supporting members of the quartet, this lack of discernment could be excused on the grounds of inexperience or amateurism, or both. But it was harder to condone in their leader, who played the drums. A thick, blunt, blue jawed man, getting on for 40 now, he had been a professional for 20 years without ever quite learning his craft. Artistically awakened and nourished by the early recordings and movies of Gene Krupa, he had spent the only happy hours of his youth in a trance of hero worshipping imitation. First intently slapping telephone books and overturning dishpans, later using a real set of drums in the sweat and liniment smells of the high school gym. Until one June night in his senior year, when the rest of the band stopped playing, the hundreds of couples stood still, and Steve Kovic felt the weight of all their rapture on his wagging, chewing head while he beat it out for 3 solid minutes. But the splendid crash of cymbals with which he ended that performance marked the pinnacle and ruin of his talent. He would never drum that well again. He would never again kindle that much admiration, nor would he ever again lose his frantic grip of the conviction that he was great and getting better all the time. Even now, at a run-down beer and pizza joint like Vito's Log Cabin, there was a negligent grandeur in the way he took the stand, the way he frowned over the arrangement of sticks and brushes and hi-hat cymbals, and then peered out, beetle-browed, to ask if the spotlight could be adjusted a fraction of an inch before he settled down. And there was elaborate condescension in the way he whisked and thumped through preliminary foxtrots, or handled the gourds for Latin American interludes. Anyone could tell he was only marking time, waiting for the moment when he could tell the boys to cut loose on one of those old-time Benny Goodman jump numbers. Only then, once or twice an hour, did he give himself wholly to his work, socking the bass drum as if to box the ears of every customer in the house, doing his damnedest on snare and tom-tom. He would take off in a triumph of misplaced virtuosity that went relentlessly on until it drenched his hair with sweat and left him weak and happy as a child. The patrons of the log cabin on dance nights were mostly high school seniors. It was the corniest band in the world, but the only live music for miles around. Besides, there wasn't any cover, and they'd serve you without proof of age, and the big parking lot was nice and dark. And a smattering of local storekeepers and contractors, who sat in a state of constant laughter with their arms around their wives, remarking on how young it made them feel to watch these kids enjoying themselves. There was an occasional tough element, too. Boys in black leather jackets and boots who slouched in the urine-smelling corner near the men's room, with their thumbs in their jeans, watching the girls with menacingly narrow eyes, and taking repeated trips to the toilet to comb and recomb their hair. And there were the regulars, lonely and middle-aged and apparently homeless, the single or inadequately married people who came to the log cabin every night, music or not, to drink and sentimentalize under the fly-blown, joke-hung mirror of its rustic bar. Not infrequently, over the past 2 years, the dance night crowd had included a party of 4 intensely humorous young adults who belonged to no discernible group at all: the Campbells and the Wheelers. Frank had discovered the place soon after moving to the country, had discovered it in search of drunkenness one night after a quarrel with his wife, and been quick to bring her back for dancing as soon as things were happier. "You people ever been to the log cabin?" he had asked the Campbells early in their acquaintance. And April said, "Oh, no, darling, they'd hate it. It's terrible." The Campbells had looked from one to the other of their faces with uncertain smiles, ready to hate it or love it or espouse whatever other opinion of it might please the Wheelers most. No, I don't think they'd hate it, Frank had insisted. I bet they'd like it. It takes a special kind of taste, is all. I mean, the thing about the log cabin, you see, he explained to them at last, is that it's so awful it's kind of nice. At first, through the spring and summer of 1953, the four of them had come here only once in a while as a kind of comic relief from more ambitious forms of entertainment. But by the following summer, they had fallen into it like a cheap, bad habit, and it was their awareness of this particular degeneration, as much as any other, that had made the idea of the Laurel Players uncommonly attractive last winter. When the Petrified Forest went into rehearsal, their attendance at the log cabin dwindled sharply. There were other, quieter places to stop for drinks on the way home from school, from the school. And in the long, uneasy time since the failure of the play, they had not come here at all, almost as if to do so would have constituted an admission of moral defeat. But what the hell, Frank had said this evening, after every conversational attempt in the Campbells' living room had petered out and died. Why don't we all break down and go to the log cabin? And here they were, a quiet foursome ordering round after round of drinks, getting up and coupling off to dance, coming back and sitting silent under the blast of the jump numbers. But for all its awkwardness, the evening was oddly free of tension, or so at least it seemed to Frank. April was as aloof and enigmatic, as far away from the party as she'd ever been in the worst of the old days. But the difference was that now he refused to worry about it. In the old days, he might have talked and laughed himself sick, trying to win an affectionate smile from her, or trying by sheer vivacity to make up for her rudeness to the Campbells. Because that was what it did amount to, sitting there like some long-necked, heavy-lidded queen among commoners. Plain damn rudeness. Instead, he was content to to relax in his chair, one hand lightly tapping the table to Steve Kovic's beat, and perform the minimal pleasantries while thinking his own thoughts. Was his wife unhappy? That was unfortunate, but it was, after all, her problem. He had a few problems, too. This crisp way of thinking, unencumbered by guilt or confusion, was as new and as comfortable as his lightweight autumn suit, a wool garbardine in a pleasingly dark shade of tan, a younger and more tasteful junior executive version of the suit Bart Pollock wore. The resumption of the business with Maureen had helped him toward a renewal of self-esteem, so that the face he saw in passing mirrors these days gave him back a level, unembarrassed glance. It was hardly a hero's face, but neither was it a self-pitying boy's, or a wretchedly anxious husband's. It was the steady, controlled face of a man with a few things on his mind, and he rather liked it. The business with Maureen would have to be brought to a graceful conclusion soon. It had served its purpose, but in the meantime he felt he was entitled to savor it. That, in fact, was what he was doing now, allowing the erotic thump of Steve Kovic's tom-tom to remind him of her hips, gazing wryly off into the swirl of dancers as he gave in to voluptuous memories. For the last 3 times, evenings when they couldn't use her apartment because of her roommate was home, she had agreed with surprising alacrity to let him take her to a hotel. Anonymous and safe behind a double-locked door in an air-conditioned tower, they had dined on room service, lamb chops, and wine while the sound of midtown traffic floated up from 20 stories below. They had reveled in the depths of a long, wide bed and lathered themselves clean in a steaming palace of a bathroom, stocked with acres of towels. And each time when he'd handed her into a taxi at last and turned alone toward Grand Central, he had wanted to laugh aloud at having so perfectly fulfilled the standard daydream of a married man. No fuss, no complications, everything left behind in a tumbled room under somebody else's name. And all of it wound up in time to catch the 10:17. It was too good to be true, like the improbable stories that older, more experienced soldiers had once told him of 3-day passes with Red Cross girls. It couldn't go on much longer, of course, and it wouldn't. In the meantime, all during the next slow tune and the one after that, he cordially danced with Millie Campbell. She made a damp, untidy package in his arms, and she talked inanely. Gosh, you know something, Frank? I don't think I've had this much to drink in years and years and years. But he was afraid that if he danced with April, now she would say, "This is horrible. Please let's go home." And he didn't feel like it. He wouldn't have minded going home alone if such a thing were possible. He had a pleasant vision of himself preparing neatly for bed with book and nightcap, bachelor style. Otherwise, he was happy enough to stay in this jumbled, lively place where the drinks were cheap and the band was loud, and he could feel the inner peace that comes from knowing that all your clothes are new and perfectly fitted. Gosh, gee, Frank, I'm afraid I'm not very. Excuse me a second. Millie lurched pathetically away toward the ladies' room, which gave him an opportunity to have a dignified drink alone at the bar. When she came out, a long time later, she looked exhausted and gray under the blue lights. Gosh, she tried to smile, giving off a faint scent of vomit. I guess Shep and I'd better sort of go home, Frank. I think I must be sick or something. I guess I'm being an awful party poop. You must think I'm. No, don't be silly. Just hold on a second, I'll get Shep. He peered dizzily into the swaying roomful of dancers until he picked out Campbell's big red neck and April's small head moving along the far wall. He gave them an urgent beckoning signal, and soon they were all four crunching in the gravel outside, wandering lost in a dark sea of automobiles. Which way? This way, over here. You okay, honey? It's so dark. The slick, chin-high tops of the cars made an undulating surface that stretched away into the darkness in all directions. Beneath it stood endless shadowy ranks of fenders and fins, of intricately bulbous bumpers and grills, alive with numberless points of reflected neon. Once, when Frank bent over to strike a match for guidance, the flame caused a writhing recoil of human flesh only inches away from his face. He had startled the pair of lovers in one of the cars. And he hurried into the darkness of the next aisle, saying, "Where the hell did we leave the damn cars then? Does anybody remember?" "Here," Shep called, "over here in the last row." "Oh, but Jesus, look, mine's blocked in." He had backed his big Pontiac against a tree hours before. Now, two other cars stood directly in front of it, and there was no room for maneuvering on either side. Lord, what a mess. Of all the inconsiderate. Damn that tree. "Well, look, though," Frank said, "we've still got one car free. We could run Millie home and bring Shep back, and maybe by that time the car will be—" "But it might take hours," Millie said weakly. "And meantime, your sitter will be costing you a fortune." "Oh, dear." "No, hold it," Shep said. "We can all go home in your car, then I'll borrow your car and come back and— no, wait. Look." April's voice cut through the confusion with such sober authority that they all stopped talking. "It's perfectly simple. You take Millie home, Frank, and go on home yourself. That takes care of both sitters. And Shep and I can wait till the other car's free. That's the only logical way." "Fine," Frank said, moving away with his car keys out and ready. "All agreed then?" The next thing Shep Campbell knew, the taillights of the Wheelers' car were winking away down Route 12, and he was walking back toward the log cabin, which throbbed now to a slow, sentimental waltz, with April's slender elbow in his hand. In all his guilty fantasies, he could never have plotted a better way of finding himself alone with her. And the funny part was that he hadn't even had to arrange it. It happened because it was the only logical— or no, wait a minute. His fuddled mind worked hard to sort it out as they mounted the steps under red and blue lights. Wait a minute. Why couldn't she have taken Millie home and left Frank behind? Wouldn't that have been logical too? By the time he'd worked it out that far, they were back on the brink of the dance floor. She had turned to him gravely with her eyes fixed on his right lapel, and the only thing to do was take her lightly around the waist and go on dancing. He couldn't ask her if she'd planned it this way without being a fool, and he couldn't assume she had without being a bigger one. Allowing his fingers to spread out very shyly on the small of her back and his hot cheek to rest against her hair, he moved to the music and was humbly grateful that the thing had happened. Never mind how. It was like the other time here last summer, but it was much, much better. The other time she'd been drunk, for one thing, and he had known even as he miserably pressed and mauled her that it was strictly a one-way deal. She'd have been too far gone to know how much she was giving him. And the proof of it was that she'd kept arching back her neck to talk and chatter in his face as if they were sitting across a bridge table or some damn thing, instead of locked as tight as lovers from the collarbone down. This time she was sober. She hardly talked at all, and she seemed as sensitive as he was to every tactile subtlety, every tentative seeking and granting and shy withdrawal and seeking again. It was almost more than his bashful heart could stand. Feel like another drink? All right. But as they stood at the bar, self-consciously sipping and puffing cigarettes among the regulars, he couldn't think of anything to say. He felt like a boy on his first date, crippled by the secret, ignorant desire of virginity. He was sweating. Tell you what, he said at last, almost roughly, I'll go check the car. And he promised himself that if she gave the slightest hint, if she smiled and said, What's your hurry, Shep? Or anything like that, he would forget everything. His wife, his fear, everything, and go for her all the way. There was nothing in her gray eyes to suggest complicity. They were the eyes of a pleasant, tired, young suburban matron who had been kept up past her bedtime. That was all. Yes, all right, she said, why don't you? Stumbling down the wooden steps and out into the darkness, grinding the pebbles fiercely under his heels, he felt all the forces of the plausible, the predictable, and the ordinary envelop him like ropes. Nothing was going to happen. And the hell with her. Why wasn't she home where she belonged? Why couldn't she go to Europe or disappear or die? The hell with this aching, suffering, callow, half-assed delusion that he was in love with her. The hell with love anyway, and with every other phony, time-wasting, half-assed emotion in the world. But by the time he'd reached the last row, he was jelly-kneed and trembling in a silent prayer. Oh God, please don't let the car be free. And it wasn't. The other car still held it fast against the tree. As he whirled back to face the building, its lights careened in his head, and he nearly keeled over. He was loaded. That last drink must have really... Wow. His lungs felt very shallow, and he knew that unless something could be done at once to stop the lights from sliding around that way, he would be sick. He began running in place, pumping his fists and bringing his knees up high, his shoes making brisk, athletic sounds in the gravel. He did that until he counted 100, taking deep breaths, and when he was finished, the lights held still. He felt chastened and full of blood as he walked back to the log cabin, where the quartet had broken into its own crude version of one of the old-time big band numbers. 1 o'clock jump or string of pearls or something. The kind of music that always took him back to basic training. She had left the bar for one of the dark leatherette booths nearby. She was sitting very straight in its deep seat, partly turned around to watch for him through the smoke, and she greeted him with a shyly welcoming smile. Still blocked in, I'm afraid, he said. Oh, well, come and sit a minute. I don't really mind, do you? He could have crawled across the leatherette seat and buried his head in her lap. What he did instead was to slide in as close beside her as he dared and begin to tear up a cardboard match in the ashtray, splitting it at the base with his thumbnail and carefully peeling it down in strips, frowning as intently as a watchmaker over his work. She was gazing off into the blur of the dance floor, moving her up-tilted head very slightly to the rhythm of that band. "This is the kind of music that's supposed to make everybody our age very nostalgic," she said. "Does it you?" "I don't know. Not really, I guess." "It doesn't me either. I'd like it to, but it doesn't. It's supposed to remind you of all your careless teenage raptures. And the trouble is I never had any. I never even had a real date until after the war. And by then nobody played this kind of music anymore. Or if they did, I was too busy being blasé to notice it. The whole big band swing period was a thing I missed out on. Jitterbugging, trucking on down, or no, that was earlier, wasn't it? I think people talked about trucking on down when I was in about the 6th grade at Rye Country Day. At least I remember writing Artie Shaw and Benny Goodman all over the sides of my school books without quite being sure who they were, because some of the older girls used to have those names on their books, and it seemed a terribly sophisticated thing to do, like putting dabs of nail polish on your ankles to hold your bobby socks up. God, how I wanted to be 17 when I was 12. I used to watch the 17-year-olds getting into cars and riding away with boys after school, and I was absolutely certain they had the answers to everything. Shep was watching her face so closely that everything else vanished from his consciousness. It didn't even matter what she was saying, nor did he care that she was talking to herself as much as to him. And then by the time I turned 17, I was shut up in this very grim boarding school, and the only times I ever really jitterbugged were with another girl in the locker room. We'd play Glenn Miller records on this old portable Victrola she had, and we'd practice and practice by the hour. And that's all this kind of music can ever really remind me of. Bouncing around in my horrible gym suit in that sweaty old locker room and being convinced that life had passed me by. That's hard to believe. What is? That you never had any dates or anything all that time. Why? He wanted to say, "Oh God, April, you know why. Because you're lovely. Because everyone must have loved you always." But he lacked the courage. Instead, he said, "Well, I mean, hell, didn't you ever have fun on vacations?" "Fun on vacations?" she repeated dully. "No, I never did. And now you see you put your finger on it, Shep. I can't very well blame boarding school for that, can I?" "No, all I ever did on vacations was read and go to movies by myself and quarrel with whatever aunt or cousin or friend of my mother's it was who happened to be stuck with me that summer or that Christmas." It all does tend to sound pretty maladjusted, doesn't it? So you're quite right. It wasn't boarding school's fault, and it wasn't anyone else's fault. It was my own emotional problem. And there's a fairly good rule of thumb for you, Shep. Take somebody who worries about life passing them by, and the chances are about 108 to 1 that it's their own emotional problem. "I didn't mean anything like that," Shep said uncomfortably. He didn't like the sardonic lines that had appeared at the pulled-down corner of her mouth, or the way her voice had flattened out, or the way she'd clawed a cigarette out of the pack and struck it in her lips. These things were too close to the cruel image he had projected of her 10 years from now. "I just meant I never would have pictured you being that lonely." "Good," she said. "Bless you, Shep. I always hoped people wouldn't picture me being that lonely. That was really the best thing about being in New York after the war, you see. People didn't." Now that she'd mentioned her life in New York, he was yearning to ask a question that had morbidly haunted him as long as he'd known her. Had she still been a virgin when she met Frank? If not, it would somehow lessen his envy. If so, if he had to think of Frank Wheeler as her first lover as well as her husband, he felt it would make his envy too great to be borne. This was the closest he had ever come to an opportunity for finding out, but if words existed to make the question possible, they had hopelessly eluded him. He would never know. Oh, it was fun, I suppose, those years, she was saying. I always think of that as a happy, stimulating time, and I suppose it was, but even so. Her voice wasn't flat anymore. I still felt, I don't know, you still felt that life was passing you by? Sort of. I still had this idea that there was a whole world of marvelous golden people somewhere, as far ahead of me as the seniors at Rye when I was in sixth grade. People who knew everything instinctively, who made their lives work out the way they wanted without even trying, who never even had to make the best of a bad job because it never occurred to them to do anything less than perfectly the first time. Sort of heroic super people, all of them beautiful and witty and calm and kind. And I always imagined that when I did find them, I'd suddenly know that I belonged among them, that I was one of them, that I'd been meant to be one of them all along, and everything in the meantime had been a mistake, and they'd know it too. I'd be like the ugly duckling among the swans. Shep was looking steadily at her profile, hoping the silent force of his love would move her to turn and face him. I think I know that feeling, he said. I doubt it. She didn't look at him, and the little lines had appeared again around her mouth. At least I hope you don't, for your sake. It's a thing I wouldn't wish on anybody. It's the most stupid, ruinous kind of self-deception there is, and it gets you into nothing but trouble. He let all the air out of his lungs and subsided against the back of the seat. She didn't really want to talk, not to him anyway. All she wanted was to sound off, to make herself feel better by playing at being wistful and jaded, and she had elected him as her audience. He wasn't expected to participate in this discussion, and he certainly wasn't to go getting any ideas. His role was to be big, dumb, steady old Shep until the car was free, or until she'd gotten all the gratification there was to be had from the sound of her own voice. Then he'd drive her home, and she'd make a few more worldly wise pronouncements on the way. She might even lean over and give him a sisterly peck on the cheek before she slithered out of the car and slammed the door and went inside to get into bed with Frank Wheeler. And what the hell else did he expect? When the hell was he ever going to grow up? Shep? Both of her slim, cool hands had reached out and grasped one of his on the table, and her face, pressing toward him, was transformed into a mischievous smile. Oh, Shep, let's do it. He thought he was going to faint. Do what? Jitterbug, come on. Steve Kovic was nearing the climax of his evening. It was almost closing time. Most of the people had gone home. The manager was counting his money, and Steve, no less than the hero of every Hollywood movie ever made about jazz, knew that this was the approach of what was supposed to be his finest hour. Shep had never really learned how to dance, let alone to abandon himself to this kind of dancing, but no power on earth could have stopped him now. Turning clumsily, hopping and shuffling in the enchanted center of that dizzy room, he allowed the noise and the smoke and the lights to revolve and revolve around him, because he was wholly certain of her now. As long as he lived, he would never see anything more beautiful than the way she reeled away as far as their joined hands would allow, and did a quick little bobbing, hip-switching curtsy out there before she came twisting back. Oh, look at her, his heart sang. Look at her, look at her. He knew that when the music stopped, she would fall, laughing in his arms, and she did. He knew, leading her tenderly away to the bar, that she would allow his arm to stay close around her while they had another drink. And she did that, too. As they talked there in suggestively low voices, he no longer cared what he was saying. What did it matter? What did words amount to, anyway? Because he was full of delirious plans. A motel sprang up in his mind's eye. He saw himself filling out the registry form in the glare of its clapboard office. "Thank you, sir. That'll be 650, number 12." While she sat waiting in the car outside, he pictured the abrupt, shocking total privacy of the cabin with its maple chair and desk and staring double bed. And here he was briefly troubled. Could you really take a girl like April Wheeler to a motel? But why not? And besides, a motel wasn't the only possibility. Miles and miles of open country lay waiting in all directions. The night was warm, and he had an old army poncho in the car. They could climb to some gentle pasture high out of sight and sound and make their bed among the stars. It started in the parking lot, in the darkness less than 10 yards away from the red and blue lighted steps. He stopped and let her turn against him in his arms, and then her crushed lips were opening under his mouth, and her hands slid up and around his neck as he pressed her back against the fender of a parked car. They broke apart and came together again. Then he led her swaying and stumbling out across the lot. It was nearly empty now, to the place where the chrome work of his Pontiac, all alone, caught faint glimmers of the starlight under the whispering black trees. He found the right-hand door and helped her in. Then he walked in a correct, unhurried way around the hood to the driver's side. The door slammed behind him, and there were her arms and her mouth again. There was the feel and the taste of her, and his fingers were finding miraculous ways to unfasten her clothing. And there was her rising breast in his hand. Oh, April. Oh, my God. April. The noise of their breathing had deafened them to all other sounds. The loud insects that sang near the car, the drone of traffic on Route 12, and the fainter sounds from the log cabin. A woman's shrieking laugh dissolving into the music of horn and piano and drums. "Honey, wait, let me take you somewhere. We've got to get out." "No, please," she whispered. "Here, now, in the back seat." And the back seat was where it happened. Cramped and struggling for purchase in the darkness, deep in the mingled scents of gasoline and children's overshoes and Pontiac upholstery, while a delicate breeze brought wave on wave of Steve Kovic's final drum solo of the night, Chet Campbell found and claimed the fulfillment of his love at last. "Oh, April," he said when he was finished, when he had tenderly disengaged and rearranged her, when he had helped her to lie small and alone on the seat with his wadded coat for a pillow and bunched himself into an awkward squat on the floorboards, holding both her hands. "Oh, April, this isn't just a thing that happened. Listen, this is what I've always... I love you." "No, don't say that." "But it's true. I've always loved you. I'm not just... Listen. Please, Shep. Let's just be quiet for a minute, and then you can take me home." With a little shock, he thought of what he'd steadfastly put out of his mind all evening, what had occurred to him briefly and not at all as a deterrent in the heat of his desire, and now for the first time began to take on an oppressive moral weight. She was pregnant. "Okay," he said. "I'm not forgetting anything." He freed one of his hands to rub his eyes and his mouth with vigor, and then he sighed. "I guess you must think I'm kind of an idiot or something." "Shep, it's not that." There was just enough light to show him where her face was, not enough for him to see its expression or even to tell whether it had any expression at all. "It's not that, honestly. It's just that I don't know who you are." There was a silence. "Don't talk riddles," he whispered. "I'm not. I really don't know who you are." If he couldn't see her face, at least he could touch it. He did so with a blind man's delicacy, drawing his fingertips from her temple down into the hollow of her cheek. And even if I did," she said, "I'm afraid it wouldn't help. Because, you see, I don't know who I am either." Walking away from the hiss and whine of a Sixth Avenue bus 3 or 4 days later, Frank Wheeler moved with a jaunty resignation toward Maureen Grube Street. He didn't especially feel like seeing her tonight, and this, he knew, was as it should be. The purpose of this visit was to break the thing off, and any impulsive eagerness for the sight of her would have been disconcerting. It always surprised and pleased him when his mood coincided with the nature of the thing he had to do, and this rare state had lately become almost habitual. He had been able, for instance, to wrap up all the rest of his Speaking of series in little more than a day's work apiece. Speaking of sales analysis, speaking of cost accounting, and speaking of payroll, all now lay safely finished along with production and inventory control in a handsome cardboard folder on Bart Pollock's desk. "Well, Frank, these are fine," Pollock had said yesterday, riffling the folder with his thumb. "And fortunately, I've got some good news for you this morning." The good news, which Frank was able to receive with perfect composure, was that plans for Pollock's project had now been finalized. There would be an informal shakedown conference next Monday, at which Frank would join his new colleagues in helping to block out a few objectives, and after which he could consider himself no longer a member of Bandy's staff. Meanwhile, it was now time for the two of us to get together here on the matter of salary. No nervous sweat broke out inside Frank's shirt as they got together on it, and no ludicrous ghost of Earl Wheeler hung over the proceedings. His eyes never strayed in dismal aesthetic searching among Pollock's office fixtures, nor was he plagued with cautionary thoughts of what April might say. It was strictly business. He was richer by $3,000 a year after shaking Pollock's thick hand that morning, a sound, satisfactory amount that would provide, among other things, a comfortable fund against which to draw for the costs of obstetrics and psychoanalysis. "Good," April said on hearing the figure. "That's about what you expected, isn't it?" "Just about, yes. Anyway, it's nice to have the thing settled." "Yes, I imagine it must be." And now, having so competently arranged his business affairs, he could give his full attention to personal matters, which did, at the moment, need considerable straightening out. For the past 2 nights or 3, his marriage had taken that technical turn for the worse, which, in the old days, would have filled him with anguish. April had begun to sleep in the living room again. But these, thank God, were not the old days. This time it hadn't come about as the result of a fight, for one thing, and it wasn't accompanied by any apparent rancor on her part. "I haven't been sleeping at all well," she had announced the first night, "and I think I'd be more comfortable alone." Okay. He had assumed, though, that it was an arrangement for that night only, and he was nettled the following evening when she again came trudging from the linen closet with an armload of bedclothes and began making the sofa into a bed. "What's the deal?" he asked mildly, leaning against the kitchen door jamb with a drink in his hand, while she flapped and spread the sheets. "You sore at me, or what?" "No, of course I'm not sore at you. You planning to go on doing this indefinitely, or what?" "I don't know. I'm sorry if it upsets you." He took his time in replying, first lazily dunking the ice cubes in his glass with the forefinger, then licking the finger, then moving away from the door with a luxuriantly tired shrug. "No," he said, "it doesn't upset me. I'm sorry you're not sleeping well." And that, of course, was the other really important difference. It didn't upset him. It annoyed him slightly, but it didn't upset him. Why should it? It was her problem. What boundless reaches of good health, what a wealth of peace there was in this newfound ability to sort out and identify the facts of their separate personalities. This is my problem, that's your problem. The pressures of the past few months had brought them each through a kind of crisis. He could see that now. This was their time of convalescence, during which a certain remoteness from each other's concerns was certainly natural enough, and probably a good sign. He knew, sympathetically, that in her case the adjustment must be especially hard. If it caused her periods of moodiness and insomnia, that was perfectly understandable. In any case, the time was now at hand when he could, in the only mature sense, be of help to her. Next week, or as soon as possible, he would take whatever steps were necessary in lining up a reputable analyst, and he could already foresee his preliminary discussions with the man, whom he pictured as owlish and slow-spoken, possibly Viennese. I think your own evaluation of the difficulty is essentially correct, Mr. Wheeler. We can't as yet predict how extensive a course of therapy will be indicated, but I can assure you of this. With your continued cooperation and understanding, there is every reason to hope for a rapid. In the meantime, the main task before him was to put an end to this business with Maureen. He would much rather have been able to do it in a bar or a coffee shop uptown. That was what he'd had in mind this morning, when he'd cornered her in an alcove of the central file to make this date. But no, come to my place, she had whispered over the spread folder they were using as camouflage. Norma's leaving early, and I'll fix supper for us. No, really, he said, I'd rather not. He would have said, the thing is, I want to have a talk with you, but her eyes frightened him. What if she should begin to cry or something, right here in the office? Instead, he said, I don't want you to go to any trouble, which was true too, but in the end he had agreed. The scene of the talk probably didn't matter. The important thing was the talk itself, and the only really important thing about that was to make it definite and final. There was, he assured himself for the 100th time, nothing to be apologetic about. It depressed him to consider how much energy he had wasted over the years in the self-denying posture of apology. From now on, whatever else his life might hold, there would be no more apologies. Excuse me, called a woman's voice from the curb. You're Mr. Frank Wheeler, aren't you? She was coming toward him across the sidewalk carrying a small suitcase, and he knew at once who she was from the predatory quality of her smile. She had caught him with his foot on the first of the pink stone steps of Maureen's building. I'm Norma Townsend, Maureen's roommate. I wonder if I could have a word with you. Sure. He didn't budge. What can I do for you? Please. She tilted her head slightly to one side as if to reprove a sullen child. Not here. And she moved past him toward an arty little espresso lounge 2 doors away. There was nothing to do but follow her, but he atoned for his meekness by staring critically at her tense, quivering buttocks. She was solid and duck-footed, wearing a modishly tubular dress, a sheath, in defiance of the fact that it emphasized her breadth and muscularity, and she trailed a perfume that had probably been described as dark and exciting in its point-of-sale display at Lord & Taylor's. I won't keep you a minute, she said, when she had him cornered at a small marble-topped table. When she'd arranged the suitcase at her feet, ordered a sweet vermouth, and put her hands through the series of clicking, snapping, and organizing motions required in the job of removing a pack of cigarettes from her complicated handbag. I've just time for an aperitif, and then I must run. I'm off to the Cape for 2 weeks. Maureen was coming with me, but she's changed her plans. She now intends to spend her entire vacation here, as I expect you know. I didn't know until last night, which I'm afraid does put me in a rather awkward position with the friends we were to visit. Are you sure you won't have a drink? No thanks. He had to admit, watching her, that she wasn't unattractive. If she could loosen her hair instead of skinning it back, if she could take off a little weight through the cheeks. But then he decided she would have to do more than that. She would have to learn not to move her eyebrows so much when she talked. And she would certainly have to get over saying things like, I've just come for an aperitif, and I'm off to the Cape. I happen to be very annoyed with Maureen at the moment, she was saying. This vacation mix-up is only the latest in a long line of foolishness, but that's beside the point. The main thing, and here she looked at him keenly, the important thing, is that I'm very deeply concerned about her too. I've known her a good deal longer, and I believe I know her better than you do, Mr. Wheeler. She's a very bright, very insecure, very sweet kid, and she's gone through a lot of hell in the past few years. Right now, she needs guidance and she needs friendship. On the face of it, and I hope you'll forgive my speaking plainly, on the face of it, the one thing she definitely does not need is to get involved in a pointless affair with a married man. Mind you, I'm not, please don't interrupt, I'm not interested in moralizing. I'd much rather feel that you and I can discuss this thing as civilized adults, but I'm afraid I must begin with an awkward question. Maureen appears to be under the impression that you're in love with her. Is this true? The answer was so classically simple that the framing of it filled him with pleasure. I'm afraid I don't think that's any of your business. She leaned back and smiled at him in a canny, speculative way, letting little curls of smoke dribble out of her nostrils, picking a flake of cigarette paper from her lip with the lacquered nails of little finger and thumb. He was reminded of Bart Pollock at lunch saying, "Let me see how good a judge of character I am." And he wanted to reach across the table and strangle her. "I think I like you, Frank," she said at last. "May I call you that? I think I even like your getting angry. It shows integrity." She came forward again, took a coquettish sip of her drink, and propped one elbow on the table. "Look, Frank," she said, "let's try to understand each other. I think you're probably a very good, serious boy with a nice wife and a couple of kids out there in Connecticut. And I think possibly all that's happened here is that you've gone and gotten yourself involved in a very human, very understandable situation. Doesn't that about sum it up?" "No," he said. "It doesn't even come close. Now I'll try, okay? Okay. Okay. I think you're probably a meddling, tiresome woman, probably or possibly a latent lesbian, and very definitely," he laid a dollar bill on the table, "very definitely a pain in the ass. Have a nice vacation." And in 4 headlong strides, one of which nearly sent an effeminate waiter sprawling with a tray of demi-tasse cups, he was out of the place. All the way up the pink stone steps, he felt he couldn't contain the giant sobs of laughter that heaved in his chest. The look on her face. But in the vestibule, where he leaned against a row of polished brass mailboxes to let it all come out of him, he found that instead of guffaws, he was capable only of a self-stifling, whimpering giggle that came in uncontrollable spasms, using only the top part of his lungs and making his diaphragm ache. He couldn't breathe. When it was over, or nearly over, he crept back to the front door, pushed aside the dusty net curtain that covered its glass, and peered down, just in time for a rear view of Norma out on the curb, wagging her handbag for a taxi. Her back was stiff with anger, and there was something extremely pathetic about her suitcase, which looked expensive and brand new. She had probably spent days buying it and weeks shopping for the things that would ride in its silken depths today. New bathing suits, slacks, sun lotion, a new camera, all the fussy, careful apparatus of a girlish good time. With the odd whimpering sound still bubbling up from his rib cage, he felt an incongruous wave of tenderness go out to her as she climbed into the cab and rolled away. He was sorry, but he would have to pull himself together now. It was time to deal with Maureen. He took several deep breaths and pressed the bell, and when the answering buzzer let him into the hallway, he was careful not to take the stairs too fast. He didn't want to be short of breath when he got there. Everything depended on his being calm. The door was on the latch. He knocked once or twice and then heard her voice, apparently coming from the bedroom. "Frank, is that you? Come on in, I'll be right out." The apartment was scrupulously clean, as if in a readiness for a party, and a faint scent of simmering meat came from the kitchenette. Only now, strolling around the carpet, did he notice that a phonograph was playing the music he was dimly aware of having heard all the way upstairs. A smooth Viennese waltz done with many violins, the kind of thing known as cocktail music. "There's some drinks and stuff on the coffee table," Maureen's voice called. "Help yourself." He did, gratefully making a stiff one, and tried to relax by sitting well back in the deep sofa. "Did you close the door," she called, "and lock it?" I think so, yes. What's all the. And are you sure you're alone? Sure, I'm sure. What's all the mystery about? She threw open the bedroom door and stood smiling there on tiptoe, nude. Then she began an undulant dance around the room in waltz time, waving and rippling her wrists like an amateur ballerina, blushing and trying mightily not to giggle as she whirled for him to the soaring strings. He barely managed to put his drink on the table, spilling part of it, before she came falling heavily into his arms and knocking the wind out of him. She was drenched in the same perfume as Norma's, and when she enveloped his head in a welcoming kiss, he saw, at startlingly close range, that she was wearing even more eye makeup than usual. Each of her lashes was as thick and ragged as a spider's leg on her cheek. Released from her mouth at last, he tried to ease himself into a more upright sitting position, to shift her weight off his belly, but it wasn't easy because her arms were still locked around his neck, and in an effort his coat and shirt were dragged painfully tight across his back and chest. Finally, he was able to free one hand to tear open his choking collar, and he tried to smile. "Hello," she murmured huskily and kissed him again, filling his mouth with her tongue. This time there was the desperation of a drowning man in his upward struggle. When he'd made it, she drew back and looked at him in dismay, her breasts wagging like little startled faces. He couldn't speak for a minute until he'd regained his breath. Then instead of looking at her, he gazed down at his own hands, which were clasping the heavy sprawl of her thighs across his lap. He released his grip, spread his fingers, and lightly tapped the upper thigh as if it were the edge of a conference table. "Look, Maureen," he said, "I think we ought to have a talk." What happened after that, even while it was happening, was less like reality than a dream. Only a part of his consciousness was involved. The rest of him was a detached observer of the scene, embarrassed and helpless, but relatively confident that he would soon wake up. The way her face clouded over when he began to talk, the way she sprang off his lap and fled for her dressing gown, which she clutched around her throat as tightly as a raincoat in a downpour as she paced the carpet. Well, in that case, there really isn't anything more to say, is there? There really wasn't any point in your coming over today, was there? These seemed to exist as rankling memories even before they were events. So did the way he followed her around the room, abjectly twisting one hand in the other as he apologized and apologized. "Maureen, look, try to be reasonable about this. If I've ever given you cause to believe that I'm not happily married or anything, well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And what about me? How am I supposed to feel? Have you thought about what kind of a position this puts me in? I'm sorry." And this was the final vignette. Maureen hunched in the belching black smoke of the kitchenette while her veal scallopini burned to a crisp. "It's not too bad, Maureen. I mean, we can still eat it if you like." "No, it's ruined. Everything's ruined. You'd better go now." "Oh, look, there's no reason why we have to be." I said, "Please go." No amount of drink in the Grand Central bars was able to blur those images. And all the way home, hungry and drunk and exhausted on the train, he sat with round, imploring eyes and moving lips, still trying to reason with her. His dread of seeing her in the office the next day was so intense that he was in the act of stepping off the elevator before he remembered that she wouldn't be there. She was on vacation. Would she follow Norma to the Cape? No. More likely she would use her 2 weeks to look for another job. In either case, he could be fairly certain he would never see her again. And his relief on realizing this soon turned perversely into a worried kind of dismay. If he never saw her again, how would he ever have a chance to explain things to her, to tell her in a level unapologetic voice all the level unapologetic things he had to say? Anxious thoughts of Maureen, should he call her up? Should he write her a letter? Still preoccupied him on Saturday, while he labored at his stone path in the dizzying heat or invented little errands that would take him away from home, allowing him to cruise aimlessly down back roads in his station car, mumbling to himself. It wasn't until early Sunday afternoon, when he'd gone out in the station car to get the papers and ended up driving for miles, that the words "forget it" rose to his lips. It was a beautiful day. He was driving over the sunny crest of a long hill, past a thicket of elms whose leaves were just beginning to turn, when he suddenly began to laugh and to pound the old cracked plastic of the steering wheel with his fist. Forget it. What the hell was the point of thinking about it? The whole episode could now be dismissed as something separate and distinct from the main narrative flow of his life. Something brief and minor and essentially comic. Norma humping out to the curb with her suitcase, Maureen leaping naked from his lap, himself padding after her through the smoke of the burning meat, wringing his hands. All now seemed as foolish as the distorted figures in an animated cartoon at the moment when the bouncing tinny music swells up and the big circle begins to close in from all sides, rapidly enclosing the action within a smaller and smaller ring, swallowing it up until it's nothing more than a point of jiggling light that blinks out altogether as the legend, "That's all, folks," comes sprawling happily out across the screen. He stopped the car on the side of the road until his laughter had subsided. Then, feeling much better, he made a U-turn and headed for home. Forget it. On the way back to Revolutionary Road, he allowed his mind to dwell only on good things. The beauty of the day, the finished job of work on Pollock's desk, the 3,000 a year, even the shakedown conference that was scheduled for tomorrow morning. It hadn't been such a bad summer after all. Now rolling home, he could look forward to the refreshment of taking a shower and getting into clean clothes. Then he would sip sherry, his lips puckered pleasurably at the thought of it, and drowse over the Times for the rest of the afternoon. And tonight, if everything went well, would be the perfect time for a rational, common-sense discussion with April about this annoying business of the sofa. Whatever was bothering her could be fixed. Could probably have been fixed days ago if he'd taken the trouble to sit down with her and talk things out. "Look," he would begin, "this has been kind of a crazy summer, and I know we've both been under a strain. I know you're feeling sort of lonely and confused just now. I know things look pretty bleak. And believe me, the house looked very neat and white, as if it emerged through the green and yellow leaves. It wasn't such a bad house after all. It looked, as John Givings had once said, like a place where people lived. A place where the difficult, intricate process of living could sometimes give rise to incredible harmonies of happiness, and sometimes to near tragic disorder, as well as to ludicrous minor interludes. That's all, folks. A place where it was possible for whole summers to be kind of crazy, where it was possible to feel lonely and confused in many ways, and for things to look pretty bleak from time to time, but where everything, in the final analysis, was going to be all right." April was working in the kitchen, where the radio was blaring. "Wow," he said, laying the heavy Sunday papers on the table. "Is this ever a beautiful day?" "Yes, it's lovely." He took a long, voluptuously warm shower and spent a long time brushing and combing his hair. In the bedroom, he inspected 3 shirts before deciding on the one he would wear with his tight, clean khakis, an expensive cotton flannel and a dark green and black plaid, and he tried several ways of wearing it before he settled on folding its cuffs back twice, turning its collar up and back and leaving it unbuttoned halfway down his chest. Crouching at the mirror of April's dressing table, he used her hand mirror to check the way the color looked from the side, and to test the effect in profile of his tightening jaw muscle. Back in the kitchen, looking over the papers and loosely snapping his fingers in time to the jazz on the radio, he had to glance at April twice before realizing what was different about her. She was wearing one of her old maternity dresses. "That looks nice," he said. "Thank you. Is there any sherry?" "I don't think so, no. I think we've used it up." "Damn. Guess there isn't any beer either, is there?" He considered having a whiskey instead, but it was too early in the day. "I made some iced tea if you'd like that. It's in the icebox." "Okay." And he poured himself a glass, without really wanting it. "Where are the kids, anyway?" Over at the Campbells. Oh, too bad. I thought I'd read them the funnies. He continued to finger through the papers for a few minutes while she worked at the sink. Then, because there was nothing else to do, he moved up close behind her and took hold of her arm, which caused her to stiffen. Look, he began. This has been kind of a crazy summer. And I know we've both been under a strain. I mean, you know I'm not sleeping with you and you want to know why, she said, pulling away from his hand. Well, I'm sorry, Frank. I don't feel like talking about it. He hesitated, and then to establish a better mood for communication, he kissed the back of her head with reverence. Okay, he said, what do you feel like talking about then? She had finished with the dishes and let the water out of the sink. Now she was rinsing the dish rag, and she didn't speak again until she had wrung it out, hung it on its hook, and moved away from the sink to turn and look at him for the first time. She looked frightened. Would it be all right if we sort of didn't talk about anything? She asked. I mean, couldn't we just sort of take each day as it comes and do the best we can and not feel like we have to talk about everything all the time? He smiled at her like a patient psychiatrist. I don't think I suggested that we talk about everything all the time, he said. I certainly didn't mean to. All I meant to All right, she said, backing away another step. It's because I don't love you. How's that? Luckily, the bland psychiatrist's smile was still on his face. It saved him from taking her seriously. That isn't much of an answer, he said kindly. I wonder what you really feel. I wonder if what you're really doing here isn't sort of trying to evade everything until until you're in analysis. Sort of trying to resign from personal responsibility between now and the time you begin your treatment. Do you suppose that might be it? No. She had turned away from him. Oh, I don't know. Yes, whatever you like. Put it whichever way makes you the most comfortable. Well, he said, it's hardly a question of making me comfortable. All I'm saying is that life does have to go on, analysis or not. Hell, I know you're having a bad time just now. It has been a tough summer. The point is we've both been under a strain, and we ought to be trying to help each other as much as we can. I mean, God knows my own behavior has been pretty weird lately. Matter of fact, I've been thinking it might be a good idea for me to see the head shrinker myself. Actually, he turned and stood looking out the window, tightening his jaw. Actually, one of the reasons I've been hoping we could get together again is because there's something I'd like to tell you about. Something kind of neurotic and irrational that happened to me a few weeks ago. And almost, if not quite, before he knew what his voice was up to, he was telling her about Maureen Grube. He did it with automatic artfulness, identifying her only as a girl in New York, a girl I hardly even know, rather than as a typist at the office, careful to stress that there had been no emotional involvement on his part, while managing to imply that her need for him had been deep and ungovernable. His voice, soft and strong, with an occasional husky falter or hesitation that had only enhanced its rhythm, combined the power of confession with the narrative grace of romantic storytelling. And I think the main thing was simply a case of feeling that my masculinity had been threatened somehow by all that abortion business, wanting to prove something, I don't know. Anyway, I broke it off last week, the whole stupid business. It's over now. Really over. If I weren't sure of that, I guess I could have never brought myself to tell you about it. For half a minute, the only sound in the room was the music on the radio. Why did you? She asked. He shook his head, still looking out the window. Baby, I don't know. I've tried to explain it to you. I'm still trying to explain it to myself. That's what I meant about its being a neurotic, irrational kind of thing. No, she said. I don't mean why did you have the girl. I mean, why did you tell me about it? What's the point? Is it supposed to make me jealous or something? Is it supposed to make me fall in love with you or back into bed with you or what? I mean, what am I supposed to say? He looked at her, feeling his face blush and twitch into an embarrassed simper that he tried unsuccessfully to make over into the psychiatric smile. Why don't you say what you feel? She seemed to think this over for a few seconds and then she shrugged. I have. I don't feel anything. In other words, you don't care what I do or who I go to bed with or anything, right? No, I guess that's right, I don't. But I want you to care. I know you do. And I suppose I would if I loved you. But you see, I don't. I don't love you, and I never really have, and I never really figured it out until this week. And that's why I'd just as soon not do any talking right now, do you see? She picked up a dust cloth and went into the living room, a tired, competent housewife with chores to do. And listen to this, said an urgent voice on the radio. Now, during the big fall clearance, you'll find Robert Hall's entire stock of men's walk shorts and sport jeans drastically reduced. Standing foursquare and staring down at his untouched glass of iced tea on the table, he felt his head fill with such a dense morass of confusion that only one consecutive line of thought came through, an abrupt remembrance of what Sunday this was, which explained why the kids were over at the Campbells', and which also meant there wasn't much time left for talking. Oh, no, listen, he said, wheeling and following her into the living room with decisive headlong strides. You just put down that goddamn rag a minute and listen to me. In the first place, you know goddamn well you love me.